Welcome to LC Screen Talk. My name is Larry, and this is my top 10 worst movies of 2020. Wasn't 2020 horrible enough without Hollywood unleashing these dumpster fires on us? So, while on the surface, it seemed like less films overall were released last year, we still got our fair share of great films, but we also still got our fair share, and honestly, maybe even more than our fair share of complete garbage. And that's why we're here today to discuss the worst of the worst that I saw in 2020. Now, of course, the quick disclaimers. These are just my opinions. This is just my own personal list. And, of course, I can only rank from the film pool that I watched last year. And I'm going to be honest, I skipped quite a few of the terrible Netflix releases. So you won't see either Adam Sandler film from Netflix here because, well, I just didn't want to watch them. But if you enjoyed one or more of the films that I mentioned here today, good on ya. I'm glad somebody did. But for me, these 10 plus dishonorable mentions just didn't do it for me. So let's go ahead and get into the countdown. I just found The War with Grandpa to be utterly grating as a viewing experience. Robert De Niro phones it in yet again and makes yet another horrible film in which he stars as somebody's grandpa. Maybe we should ban Robert De Niro from starring in anything with grandpa in the title. That's what I'm thinking. But other than that, Rob Riggle was in the cast right then and there. I knew it was going to be garbage. And, well, it was. There were no laughs. It was so broad and obnoxious. I just really couldn't get on board with this family flick. Now, this all the way down at number 9 might be quite the surprise, but ultimately, after we collided, pretty much gave me exactly what I was expecting it to give me. And at the very least, it was on par with the first. Unlike a lot of the other films on this list, there was no hope going in, and maybe that's why I didn't think it was quite as bad. But don't get me wrong, the acting in here is absolutely terrible. The screenplay, this script, is definitely in contention for one of the absolute worst of 2020. I honestly don't know that they adapted anything and our characters weren't just reading off of this amateur fanfic. Yikes. In a lot of ways, I think this film is actually more toxic in its messaging and relationship depiction than the first was. So, oof, that's rough. But we got to see the hero boy's butt, so I guess that's something. There was hope for The Grudge when I saw this cast, and unfortunately, all of that hope was wildly misguided because this remake was dreadful. There were no scares. The story is an absolute bore fest. Our characters are completely unendearing, and the plot deviates so hard from the original mythology. For one, we take it out of Japan and bring it on back to the United States, but two, that fact in and of itself completely spits in the face of the original story. Not to mention the ending is just a mess. Overall, The Grudge brought no scares and instead a whole lot of eye rolls. Oh, The Turning, the film without an ending. I have to say, The Turning had more positives than a lot of the other films here on this list. The production design was beautiful. I do think Mackenzie Davis and some of our other actors in here were at least trying, and at times it did pull off that kind of gothic, atmospheric horror feel. Unfortunately, the ending and the actual mythology and story itself was so infuriating and frustrating that it had to be included on this list. The fact that they just pretty much stopped the film like mid scene, mid plot, No explanation. Nothing else to be seen or heard from is ridiculous and automatically made The Turning one of the worst viewing experiences I saw in 2020. In addition, while there were moments of good-ish atmosphere to be had, ultimately this is only filled with jump scares. There's nothing more. Some of the acting is completely terrible and it didn't make any sense. So just go ahead and turn away when you see The Turning. Let's go ahead and adapt a comedy sitcom series and make it horror. Well, the problem is they didn't really make it horror because there's literally no scares to be seen here, and instead just still made it an unintentional comedy. Lucy Hale can't seem to pick a feature film project to save her life because this career, up to this point, is looking rather dreadful. I have to say, even Truth or Dare was more unintentionally fun than Fantasy Island. And again, this also had an all-star cast, and I think they do okay with what they're given. Unfortunately, what they're given is complete trash. The twist at the end of this film is so stupid and ridiculous. I couldn't actually believe that they went down this path. Otherwise, it was kind of like Saw Light with bad graphics, terrible dialogue, and huge sweeping stereotypes that unfortunately led to quite a problematic subplot. Yeah. Fantasy Island was just no fantasy for me, I'll say that. And the award for most misguided film of 2020 goes to Antebellum. Oh my gosh. These filmmakers really thought they were saying something with that third act, and instead gave us black torture porn. Racist white folks, you can go ahead and live out your deepest fantasies through Antebellum. That's how wretched the twist turned out to be in this film. Completely offensive, unnecessary, and it left me physically angry as that twist started to unfold. And it's a shame because Janelle Monáe does deliver a fantastic performance in this film. And there were ideas in here, little nuggets that could have said something, could have made an interesting film about race relations. And they just took all of that and smashed it to pieces for a shock for shock's value twist that ultimately led us down a very, very dark path. I mentioned it doesn't really have a lot of horror to it. There's not a lot of actually good scares, and throughout that middle portion, it completely just drags. So the only time we're getting any action is when we're explicitly and unnecessarily showing black people being tortured. Yeah. Oh my gosh, what was this? Spencer Confidential was such a hot mess. And I'm so sad that Winston Duke was talked into starring in this because I love you, Winston Duke. But this was not it. Mark Wahlberg is back yet again to star in another film where he's in some form of law enforcement or firefighter or soldier. You know, what Mark Wahlberg does. But my goodness, is his character overly grating. The treatment of women in this film was absurd. The entire plot line is both convoluted yet overly stupid that it's actually quite an achievement. The script and dialogue are so dumb. None of the jokes land. None of the action is actually entertaining, leaving Spencer Confidential to feel like this overly long slog because it's just completely and totally boring when it's not being offensive and dumb. Up until the final stretch of 2020, I was positive Artemis Fowl was keeping that #1 spot on this list. I just happened to see two films I liked even less, but wow, was Artemis Fowl bad. And this is coming from someone who hasn't actually even read the books, and I was still infuriated watching it. Now, expectations were already pretty low, but I have a soft spot for fantasy, and even not good fantasy seems to have some enjoyment for me. Unfortunately, Artemis Fowl had none. There was no enjoyment to be had. This was so much worse than the already low bar it had set for itself. All of the actors in this film are terrible. I don't know what Judi Dench did to the higher ups in Hollywood, but we have to save her because Katz and Artemis Fowl as a 1-2 punch on her late legendary career is an absolute crime. Colin Farrell's hardly in the film. It's negligible. That little boy is a terrible actor. And Josh Gad seemed like he was having fun, but his character was trash. So the costumes were so boring and horrible for a fantasy fairy world. We got this drudgy, militant, hole in the ground type of atmosphere with these spacesuit costumes. What? I'm still haunted in my nightmares by Josh Gad unhinging his jaw. The fact that the Centaur Man was neighing, literally neighing. Oh my gosh. Once again, Judi Dench delivers lines straight into the camera. Super cheesy, horrible lines. Our main character had nothing interesting going on. This adventure, this plight was so boring. Aside from a couple of nice visuals, there was literally nothing redeemable about Artemis Fowl. Yeah, this film was in fact foul. Last minute entry onto the ranking. Songbird was right up there with Antebellum in being the most misguided thing I watched of 2020. But ultimately, I don't know if this one was actually misguided or just in terrible taste, because I think they made the film they set out to make, and it was just in horrible taste. Why anyone thought it was a good idea to release a film about COVID and the pandemic in the middle of the pandemic, still killing thousands of people, is beyond me. This gets the most tone deaf film of the year award because what? But add on top of that the message that the film actually sends makes it even worse. It's one step away from being a propaganda piece telling you that the government is just trying to control you in the middle of a pandemic. Yeah, that's the message we should be sending while people are literally still dying. Then on top of that, we have this bland romance mixed in with several other converging subplots, one of which is Alexandra Daddario's subplot, which is just dreadful, and I don't know why it was included. KJ Apa does okay, but literally everybody else in the film was pretty dreadful. The action is, ugh. The way it's shot is horrible. And ultimately, we were just given an offensive dollar store version of a Michael Bay film. The only saving grace, well, we saw KJ Apa's butt. So there you go. I guess that kept it from being number one. Now, before I unveil my number one pick for the worst film of 2020, let's go ahead and talk about some dishonorable mentions that just barely missed the cut. She Dies Tomorrow was basically art house trash that tried to deliver on messages of anxiety, but ultimately just delivered a good time for a nap. Doolittle did the least. With some dodgy CGI, a horrible Robert Downey Jr. accent, and a third act that just makes you roll your eyes. Animal Crackers was a low-budget animated film that delivered the lowest of the low in humor aimed at children with a derivative storyline that just failed on most all accounts. Another Netflix animated film that just barely missed the cut, Pokemon Mewtwo Strikes Back, a remake of Pokemon the first movie, this time in 3D CGI. It's quite nearly, even more so than The Lion King, a shot-for-shot remake of that first film, just dumbed down and sucked up of all of its soul and heart. Brahms the Boy 2 was yet another early year horror film that disappointed and made me shake my head. Once again, where are the scares? But even worse, it completely and totally negates everything that happened in the first film. And then finally, Like a Boss wastes such great talent in our three leading women for a dull, shrill chick flick that lacks any sort of real laughs. And now, the moment you've been waiting for. My pick for the worst film of 2020 is... Whew, I literally found almost zero positives with this film. Josh Duhamel made his directorial debut with this mess, and I'm saying, give it up. Your job is to look pretty in front of the camera because that is what you do best. Go back to playing hot dads because directing clearly is not for you, Josh. Buddy Gaines literally has the most ridiculous messaging attempt I have seen in a film from 2020, filled with the most vile, gross, bottom of the barrel trash humor of any film I've seen in 2020. Like, I don't even know if the Adam Sandler films that came out this year could compete with what Buddy Gaines had to offer as attempts at humor. There's this weird attempt to be inclusive that ultimately turns out to be quite offensive. Once again, the treatment of women off to the side is ridiculous. The ending of this movie is so flippin' dumb that it blew my mind. This film was quite literally the biggest waste of time in film for this year. It just literally took up money, took up space that could have went to almost anything that would have been better. We have Rob Riggle on the list, we have Lucy Hale on the list, and now we've got the trifecta because here's Olivia Munn, and you know the rule. If Olivia Munn's name is on that poster, you can expect for it to be trash. If you haven't seen Buddy Games, there's no fun to be had in this ridiculous game, so just steer clear. That was it. Those were the worst films I had the unfortunate experience of watching in 2020. Now, I'm gonna go gargle with bleach and hope that it takes that nasty taste out of my mouth and never think of these movies again if I can help it. What did you think of my list? Do you agree? Do you disagree? More importantly, leave your worst films of 2020 in the comment section down below, or of course, you can hit me up on Twitter. If you like this video, hit that like button down below and subscribe to the channel so you are always up to date on my latest videos, including my awaited best of 2020 movies video yet to come. I love you all so much for your continued support. Mwah! Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!